Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this keynote lecture on Robert MacPherson, The Painter's Reach. For those of you I don't know, my name is Chris Sains and I'm the Director of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. I wish to recognise the traditional owners who first cared for the lands and fished the waters of the Brisbane River along the edge of Kurulpa Point, millennia before European settlement. They were the first peoples of this place, its first creative and visual artists. They gathered here at a vital crossing point, a place of meeting and exchange, a place in which to share stories as we gather today. In the spirit of reconciliation, as an Australian, I acknowledge the contribution that elders past and present have made and continue to make to this very remarkable place in which we all live. Though he operates in a resolutely international context, Robert MacPherson is Brisbane-born and based, and his work has an abiding sense of place and of the local, informed by Australian and especially Queensland history and the vernacular. The development of this exhibition began in November 2013, when the artist accepted our proposal to present a major survey of his work, spanning the early to mid-70s to the present day. In the estimation of many, this had been a very long overdue project. Notwithstanding Robert's earliest dealer gallery exhibitions here, with Ray Hughes in the early 70s, and almost a dozen consecutive projects over the years at the IMA, I would argue that his work has not received anything like the broader local attention that it clearly has long deserved. It has been some 20 years since the last survey of this kind, curated by Trevor Smith, who joins us today, including in our public program, for the Gallery of Western Australia, and later touring to the Museum of Contemporary Art, Sydney, but not to Brisbane. So this is a very good moment for us, and it's also a moment in which we present, for the first time, a gallery-curated exhibition honouring an Australian artist here at GOMA. We've had other versions of that in the past at QAG and collaborative projects here, but never before have we given our major spaces over to one artist. It could not be more warranted. We're enormously proud then to present Robert MacPherson, The Painter's Reach at GOMA, and very pleased to have collaborated with Brisbane-based Brisbane-born, New York-based international curator and writer Ingrid Perez on its completion. After Ingrid's keynote address, I hope you'll stay on to join us for other programs today, which include at 1:30, Angela Goddard, Director of Griffith Artworks, in conversation with Daniel Thomas AM, Emeritus Director, Art Gallery of South Australia, in a tour of the exhibition spaces. At 2:30, there's a writer's discussion with Angela again, she's busy today, with Ingrid, writers Ewan MacDonald and Trevor Smith, Curator of Contemporary Art at Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, and that's next door to us here in Cinema B. At 3:30, QAGOMA's Head of Australian Art, Jason Smith, is in conversation with artist and educator Peter Cripps and artist and long-time MacPherson correspondent Peter Tyndall within the exhibition space again. So just some brief introductory remarks about Ingrid. As I said, Ingrid is New York-based and has been for very many years. She's both a curator and a writer who's worked with Robert MacPherson over a very extended period of time. She's a former Harkness Fellow and a graduate of the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program and of New York University. She's curated several exhibitions of MacPherson's work, including Robert MacPherson, The Described and Undescribed at AGNSW in 1994, and Robert MacPherson, Mirangi at Artspace Sydney in 1998. She's the former Director of Interpretive Teaching at the American Museum of Moving Image in New York, the author of a monograph on Adam Cullen, and has written extensively about contemporary Australian and international art. It's been an enormous privilege and pleasure to have worked with her on the creation of this exhibition, and I now invite her to present a keynote address.
Thank you, Chris. The subject of this exhibition and this talk is Robert MacPherson. The Brisbane-born artist whose practice combines wide-range musings on the act of painting with a reverence for the local and the everyday, or what we might call the world to hand. Those last three images are taken from Robert's correspondence with artist Peter Tyndall, now held upstairs in the library. This combination on thinking about the act of painting, this attention to the local, this attention to what's at hand, has fueled a series of questions. What is a painting? Is a painting a container for the artist's physical reach? What is the difference between the artist and the artisan? What is a name? How do we conceive that which is yet unnamed? This from a work called The Described, the Undescribed. And most recently, how do we think colour? Or when we think blue, which blue? Is there a category blue, or is there only specific instances of blue? These are all questions which, when combined with the use of what's to hand, a paintbrush, a printed packet, a painted roadside sign, a dry cleaner's receipt, ensures a reach that begins with the particular and extends far beyond. MacPherson thinks with and through his paintbrush. Since his earliest exhibitions, MacPherson has attended to the painter's job, to the work and thought of painting. And this has continued to inform his practice even when he adopted other modes of working. Thinking through painting as a tool-bound practice of mark-making, he has always been aware of the culturally sanctioned place it occupies within the institutions of collecting and the discipline of art history, sites he calls the hallowed halls. In this vein, his work can be understood as an ongoing engagement with propositions about the work of art itself. These concerns are extended beyond the activity of painting in the important component of his practice known as the frog poems. Here, MacPherson uses tools and names, work practices, nicknames, the forgotten and the almost gone. These names are all stock roots, some of which have fallen into disuse, on things that might otherwise be passed over in an accelerating modernisation, and which very often evoke a palpable mode of being forged by a particular place. Now, this reference to history, to language, and through his practice of using titles dedicated to people he's known, the addition of autobiography, we might think, bends the rules of high modernism, something he has long done, even when working in a most avowedly formalist manner. And while he produces work replete with what might be called local content, and look here at the Australian species listed, his suspicion of any claims to a national art is widely noted. Indeed, one of the questions his work asks is how, within an art historical framework that acknowledges both Marcel Duchamp and Clement Greenberg, the idea of local content is possible. For the entire span of his career, writers have been posing related questions using a shifting vocabulary of terms: parochialism versus modernist abstractions, so-called internationalism, centre versus periphery, and in Imants Tiller's famous words, the failure of locality, or we might think of the failure of location, to explain why Australian cultural forms take the form they do. MacPherson's body of work constantly refigures the terms of place. How do we locate MacPherson's practice? More than 25 years ago, Dan Cameron, who was then senior curator at New York's Museum of Contemporary Art, quipped that Bob was the best kept secret of Australian art. At the same time, European curator René Bloch put MacPherson in a lineage of European avant-garde artists in his Biennale of Sydney. Within Australia, MacPherson's work has been shown in a wide variety of contexts. It's been considered funny, minimalist, conceptual. It's been seen as a fluxus practice, an abstract practice. He's been seen as an archival artist as well. And all the time he has maintained a presence in 6 Sydney Biennales where he's been viewed as somehow marking something succinct about the nature of contemporary art. MacPherson's practice is increasingly international, having been included in shows in Wales, Germany, Sao Paulo, Belgrade and The Hague. He was recently included in the 1+1=3 exhibition in Lisbon and the inaugural Sharjah Biennale, from where this image comes. And I think this could be from anywhere. The hamburger could be from anywhere. The little landscape that the hamburger suggests could be from anywhere. The question then, how do we locate MacPherson's practice, is one to which I will return, but with no attempt to answer. When putting this exhibition together, I wanted to show that MacPherson begins as a painter and working through the so-called limits of formalist painting as developed by Clement Greenberg, arrives at a practice that is capable of generating endless possibilities within these and other limits. The painter's reach can be described as an internal narrative of generation, but this would imply some kind of development or a change or an advance, and I think a far better way of understanding Robert's practice overall is in his own words, from a work called 3 Paintings, where he looked at the painted handle of his paintbrush and realised the handle of his paintbrush is already a painting. If he wants to continue as a painter, he need do nothing more than simply exhibit paintbrushes as paintings. So we could, one way of understanding his practice is any move beyond this point is superfluous. The Painter's Reach, the exhibition then, begins with MacPherson's early explorations of painting as process, as mark-making on a stretched canvas. While reading Clement Greenberg and Arts Magazine, this is not Clement Greenberg and this is not Arts Magazine. This was the first exposure Robert had to the work of Jackson Pollock in a very famous Life magazine spread in 1955, I believe. But it quotes Clement Greenberg, who coined the phrase that Jackson Pollock was the greatest living painter in the United States. Robert was reading Clement Greenberg, looking at Arts Magazine, and also looking at the Washington School of Colourfield Painters, and just as importantly, working as a ship's painter and docker. He came to understand that the brush and the body were tools, providing their own limits, which could determine the production of work. Through a very important trip to Europe, where he saw a range of pre-Napoleonic measures, he understood that the scale of the body provided a pleasing proportional system. He understood how tools determined the proportions of the objects they were used to create. Wanting to create something that was truly his, he came upon the idea of using his own bodily proportion, which his physical reach, vertical and horizontal, would then determine the size of his canvases. As MacPherson devised different procedures for making work, some works recorded his vertical reach, some works recorded the splash of paint, the seeping of paint. He developed several ideas that offered him a conceptual structure for his practice. One of these, and you can see how he's working through. It's just simply a working through of ways of making marks with a brush. And the width of those stretches is determined by the width of the brush used. These are two works called Scaled from the Tool, both in the exhibition. As he devised procedures for making this work, he developed several means that offered him a conceptual structure. One of these was the notion that the paintbrush contained in microcosm the elemental world of animal, vegetable, mineral. The paintbrush could also be scaled up, as Chris has called it, to produce a sculptural work, or a work that at least has some kind of sculptural presence, playing off the division between painting and sculpture that was so important in the late 60s. Here, he simply takes the form and the size of the brush. I think it's fairly clear what he's doing. Another idea he developed was the concept of inherency, that the painter's tool contained within itself the painterly image, that you really didn't have to look much further than what was in your hand if you wanted to begin generating work. We see this in the Quink series. If anyone can remember Quink bottles of ink, that's the logo, from which he made 70 very beautiful drawings with the inks that he'd used on each one recorded on the back. And he tells me that that green ink, which I think was auditor's ink, is no longer reproduced, is no longer produced by Quink. These ideas of inherency recur in MacPherson's practice beyond the time when he first formulated them, which was the late 70s. For instance, in this work, All English Literature Unwritten, from 1981, it's as if the typewriter can contain everything, and that is the beauty of the 26-character English alphabet. Or the telephone, which has silent poems are held within this rectangle, listen. And I think it signals a shift in Robert's thinking. I don't want to say he moves away from the materiality of paint, but for a time he had no studio in which he could paint, and he begins a very active period of making work by other means. This period produced a lot of quantities of works on paper, some of which are included in the large vitrine outside with the red walls. And this work often feeds back into other aspects of his practice, and as we shall see, was very important for what I'm calling his return to painting. This is from that period, showing different relics of boredom sculpture. And it's a collective title for a vast range of material filed while a cleaning supervisor, and shows MacPherson attentive to, among other things, the rhythms of untutored language. We'll get there in a minute. And the micropolitics of a prosaic working life. Is that legible? Let me explain how these works on paper came about. While Robert was a cleaning supervisor at the Brisbane City Council, working the afternoon shift, he would, of course, be gathering up detritus and would often collect the most interesting little notes. He would also collect paper clips, discarded staples, and lawyer's tape, from which he would make things. Sometimes the objects had already been made by possibly bored office workers. But I think throughout you see this necessity to work with the hand, as well as a wonderful eye. This is quite beautiful. And this is very funny. But that's Robert's ear, attentive to how people speak. From approximately the same period, he issued a text piece called I Always Buy My Lunch at the Mayfair Bar, which comprised a typewritten text, manila folders, and found objects. So that's the Mayfair Bar, which was a Brisbane milk bar and sandwich shop, just round the corner from Jojo's and Sports Girl, the precise location of which Peter Anderson and I hope to clarify. It describes in very prosaic, repetitive language. Robert has read Gertrude Stein to good effect. Going and buying a sandwich, making the decision, the procedures of sandwich making, the fact that one slathers on a surface, various viscous substances, and that some people have greater or lesser facility for the process. He realised very quickly this was like painting a painting. So this is we might say, the founding text. Very soon he starts adding things to this text and simply compiling hundreds of pieces of paper that take this form. Here we might say this image, this object, which is a label, is authorised to belong to that text, to become part of this conjunction because it relates to food. So there's some kind of necessary relationship between the two. But very quickly, Bob understands he can put anything on that paper. And we'll see this later on in his work. If we go back to the Mayfair Bar, we can understand it as providing a recipe for painting, and it underwrites the production of a group of sign paintings a decade and a half later, and then again some 10 years later, as MacPherson revisits the Mayfair Bar. And this work, this subsequent work, looks very different. In the early to mid-80s, MacPherson made work in collaboration with other artists, and this was using alternative models of practice and of exhibition, often using temporary sites. This work was made in exchange or often correspondence with Gunter Chrisman, in this case, small Willem II cigarillo boxes filled with things found from the factory floor or the streets of Sydney, which Gunter would then subsequently use for paintings. He also began a very extensive and extremely important correspondence exchange with the artist Peter Tyndall, and worked closely with Peter Cripps and John Nixon when they were directors at Brisbane's Institute of Modern Art. Peter Cripps, who's the best chronicler of this period, has called this practice recession art, and it's evidence of a very active exchange of ideas that was based in Brisbane in the early 1980s. And this Cheers Bob is just signalling that for a while we're not going to be looking at painting. So, in 1982-83, while thinking about the limits of painting, not the death of painting, but the fact that the world was awash in what Roberts called image pollution, and that any painted surface could, in a sense, become a painting, he understood that a can of paint might be considered a painting that wasn't yet painted. That idea of inherency still lingering in his thought. He had an epiphany, a very, we might say, mundane epiphany, but again, it's MacPherson thinking with his brush. Bending to polish his shoes one day, he realised, my shoes are paintings. And from this point on, painting in a sense becomes redundant and he stops painting, at least temporarily. And this realisation, My Shoes Are Paintings, helps announce, because it appears in the title, the frog poems, begun in earnest in the second half of the 80s and prompted by an exchange with Peter Tyndall. Not this image, but this is standing in. This is an ongoing body of work structured around the fundamental linguistic act of naming and using the formal structure of pairing or conjunction, one thing on another. It very often took the form of an object, whether an empty wine bottle, a plastic lobster, a chainsaw, in this case, a dartboard, paired with a Latin species name. The frog poems, when they began, initially presented a range of signs that we could call motivated. That is, a coupling of object, dartboard, and word, pseudo-frani douglassi, where a feature of the chosen object was acknowledged in the name. Let me explain. The Douglas toad, which is endemic in West Australia, has a brown back with an orange stripe in the middle. So you can see there is a visual similarity between the object and the object named. It also has an orange triangle on the snout. The belly is smooth and mottled black and white. Now, linguists have told us that naming is an arbitrary process. There's no necessary relationship between the furry thing that we know of as a cat and the sounds k at t. But MacPherson reverses this. He actually presents us with a world where objects are kind of endowed with something special, and as are names. But as he developed the frog poems, the links between the names and the objects became looser, more explicitly poetic and elusive. If we look at this work, which is in the exhibition and is in the GOMA collection, but I'm sorry, Chris, I couldn't find a photo of it installed out there. The 17 canvas stretches of, and I will read the full title, 17 frog poems for GN and AW, who by example taught the kinder way, 1987 to 1989, are paired with the names of 17 burrowing or hibernating. Scientifically, the process is called estivating or summer sleeping frogs. Here, 17 objects paired with 17 names. The objects are designed for human sleep, and so they kind of double or replicate the distinguishing feature of the species that are listed. We might say his act makes the object special. Now, the frog poems were not divorced from features of MacPherson's earlier paintings. In a suite of canvases from the late 70s, he had used the limits of his physical reach, as I mentioned, to determine the dimensions of each canvas. And he was beginning a consideration of the canvas as a kind of container for paint and painted marks, marked and bound by his own body. A number of frog poems continue in this vein. These are stretches which are scaled for a sleeping human. We can consider them, perhaps, as paintings of sleep. In his hands, bodily scaled domestic textiles, blankets, tablecloths, become paintings when they're stenciled with names. And these paintings invoke the life of the body, of food and drink, sleep, sex, and death. This, a work that's in the exhibition, White Angel, 8 frog poems for Little Jock, Hollywood George, Tom Pepper, Percy the Punter, and Waddy Funnel, 1983 to 1993, lists a methylated spirits drinkers' cocktails. All those individuals named in the title are men Bob knew from his youth in Nambour, and he's described them as the bagmen who lived under bridges. These are paintings in which to wrap a body, But they also suggest, each name suggests an image, and it's an image in the mind's eye. It's an image that will be different for every person who encounters this work. And this work anticipates the explicitly, and again, Chris, I apologise, I didn't have a good installation shot to work with, the explicitly memorial work, Murrinjai, 15 Frog Poems, A Keening, 1996 to 1997, which takes up our elements of black and white history in the pastoral industry. And through these and other frog poems, MacPherson offers a testament to the lost. These are drovers. This is a testament to drovers and their sexual partners in the 50s who may or may not have been given M&B 693 as a self-administered treatment for gonorrhoea. It's a testament to particular histories and vernacular languages. I believe probably only Catalonians know M&B 693 because today it's used on cattle. But sometimes the frog poems could be very funny. Yeo Sui Hong, which is an autobiographical work, recalls one of Robert's trips to Singapore when he came across a proprietor of Chinese medicine using the frog logo. And it was from this time that Robert had his epiphany about the painted shoes comprising paintings. So this is a frog poem. This is also, according to MacPherson logic, a painting. And we might see here that while MacPherson does indeed stop painting, painting's never too far away from his mind. The memorial function of some of the frog poems, coupled with MacPherson's long-standing interest in Russian constructivism and suprematism, can be seen in this, a work from the current exhibition, Green Pisser, 18 Frog Poems, 18 Constructions, a homage to Ivan Puny, 1987-1989. A title that needs a little unpacking, but is also richly suggestive of the way that Robert can layer many things together. A green pisser was a colloquial Nambour name that boys used to describe a certain species of cicada. It dates from Robert's youth when young boys would trade and collect cicadas. These are constructions, bird boxes, purchased, I believe, at Kmart, but made by an organisation like Endeavour Foundation. It's also a homage to Ivan Puny, the Russian suprematist who fled the Soviet Union and established a very different artistic practice in Paris under a French name. We have then Robert's history. We have the elements of natural history because the work is accompanied by a list of native Australian reptile species. And we have this very funny conjunction of bird boxes with art history because they do look like little constructivist works. And it's this kind of unwitting, sometimes, correspondence that I think Robert takes great delight in. So there's an elusiveness here, and not all MacPherson's memorialisations are sombre, as I think we see in 1,000 Boss Drovers Outside. Soon after showing the first frog poem combinations, and these, I think, as I think back when I first saw them, were a little baffling, and a lot of the writing I did about them was trying to unpick the references and just explain what was going on. And then Robert showed something that to me was truly baffling, and I was not alone. He showed a small group of drawings executed by Robert Peeney, 4th grade student of St Joseph Convent, Nambour. And these initially had the word frog poem in the title. So one way of understanding them was as a simple conjunction of a thing, in this case what looks to be like a page from an old child's sketchbook and a name or a series of words. Now, Pini can be considered an autobiographical alter ego in that he shares a number of features in common with the artist. And through this little boy, Robert Pini, MacPherson can engage very directly with all kinds of content that were not allowed within the strictures of Greenbergian formalism. Pini is a very complicated conceit then, even a ruse, and it's allowed him to pursue an archival project of tremendous scope, which we can see outside. And I'm beginning to think this is an unphotographable work, which is, you know, one of the many interesting features of it. But I think it's important to remember that these are frog poems. We have a name and we have an object. What's the relationship between the two? We want to pin that face to that name. I think resemblance is something that takes place in the mind's eye rather than the picture plane. While MacPherson's practice reveals the force of ideas in generating and structuring work, and for this reason he has been labelled a conceptualist, he's never disdained the fact of touch or materiality. And I think the painter's reach makes this very clear through the consistency of his painterly touch across decades. Oh, right. We're just going to skip this because I'm looking at time. From the scale from the tool paintings to this, a signage work, Mayfair Swamp Rats, 97 signs, 1994 to 1995, from the Queensland Art Gallery collection. This is a view of it as installed downstairs in the Children's Arts Centre, and I all encourage you to go and see the wonderful Swags and Swamp Rats project. These works, typically large scale, acknowledge vernacular roadside signs which advertise everything from car parts to vegetables, while at the same time often serving a distinctly memorial function in their title dedication. This work is dedicated to Crib Islanders that Robert MacPherson knew in his youth at Northgate. Their playful abbreviation, some of which I hope is visible, and misspelling challenge sense when we try to read them, cueing us to the way he asks us to kind of suspend legibility for the purpose of seeing the formal qualities at stake here, the different kinds of paint handling, which become more apparent as the series progress, as does the way colour and line hold ground. I think it's important to remember when we look at these, the Mayfair signs that are strictly verbal, he also wants us to see it as an arrangement of paint on a rectangle. The title of this work, Mayfair, signals the resurgent presence of the Mayfair text from the very early 1980s, which informed a large number of paintings taking this form. We can understand them as immediate paintings in the landscape, indeed as native landscape signs employing a vernacular language. Also installed outside. So these are peculiarly native, indeed local, and I use native in the sense in which the American agrarian poet and activist Wendell Berry uses it, as in native to the place, which is something that one can grow into, but which possibly has very different resonances in Australia. Muddies is an abbreviation that I would suggest is peculiarly Australian. It's not how Americans speak, for instance. The challenge here is to see them and read them, and to not read them, to read and not read at the same time, to see the words as dispositions of line on board rather than as elements called graphemes which lead us to make sense of them. Here the name is treated as an image, which kind of doubles the meaning while undoing it. Here we have this wonderful play of repetition, which seems to undo meaning. Robert can double things and make them slightly morbid. Other works in the Mayfair series use images, but perhaps these images are a bit of a ruse, for the real interest is in painterliness. So this is interesting. This is a detail from Chitters. Here MacPherson has refined his process, not unlike he did in the 70s, to an almost Zen-like degree, with the sweep of the arcs strongly recalling the painter's arm and appealing to us in a profoundly kinesthetic sense. Combining a high degree of painterliness with economy and wit, these Mayfair paintings show how MacPherson achieves very different ends with reduced means. This has always been one of the features of his paintings from the 70s, and this recent return to painting, which we'll see in a moment, acknowledges again that earlier Mayfair text work. Recently, Robert announced that he was mining his archive, minding his busyness, going back, looking forward, and as a consequence produced suites of distinctly colourful, I'm going to use the word monochromes, but they're not. Single colour might be closer, but many of them are not single colour paintings based on the procedures detailed in the original Mayfair bar text. These offer a great contrast to the black and white incident paintings of the early 70s and show some of the endless possibilities of that text as a recipe for paintings. I think it's very clear to see the delight Robert takes in painting these. This is a work not in the exhibition. This is if we can understand them, if we wish, is slathering butter on white bread and brown bread. But he is, again, going back to questions that early animated his thinking about painting, about how figures and colours hold the ground on a painted canvas surface. There is also another return in this later work, a return to the body. In the Peerless series, the size of the canvases being the size of MacPherson's shirt yoke, the horizontal dimension. Here MacPherson takes the dry cleaner's receipt, 5 blue. What can I do with 5 blue? I can make something very beautiful. He revisits the process-generated thinking of scale from the tool, but this time in a very colourful fashion, alluding to post-painterly abstraction perhaps, and in this work, well, we'll go back to that. This work, for my mother who loved purple and my father who called it heliotrope. And again, if we look at the sides, beautiful incident. But I think if we take the title on board, not simply as an autobiographical and very lovely one to his parents, and try to think it through, we could spend a lot of time with this work. These works began as Mayfair Peerless works, Mayfair a signal to that text, to the works that used colour. Peerless is the name of Robert's dry cleaner. And after a while, they simply became peerless works as the series developed. The most recent instance of this revisits Robert's own history, in a sense, twice over. His first job on leaving school was in a department store in Brisbane where he was in the accounts department, working with the people he called the shiny asses, and recalling a time when the managerial class, the office workers, would have breast pockets with fountain pens that would leak. And then later, when he was a cleaning supervisor, middle-level management, the same kind of short-sleeved uniform. The short-sleeved white shirt, a distinct feature of Queensland, I would argue. And from his tool, he is able to create beautiful, colour-filled colour-stained paintings, recalling perhaps Morris Lewis, a proponent of the Washington School of Painters. Works that Robert looked at very attentively early on in his career. So he's going back here many times to points in his own history. And I think perhaps one could see this as a veiled self-portrait, were one so inclined. Because this continues and encapsulates some of the founding questions of his work as a painter, I chose it as the last work of the painter's reach. But I think it's fair at this point to ask, who is Robert MacPherson? This painter who has looked deeply, as Trevor Smith shows so pervasively in the catalogue, at Chinese and Japanese calligraphy and porcelain. He is also, as Pam Bell, an astute observer in the 70s, wrote, minimalist, serene, a difficult artist to categorise. Recently, Dr. Rex Butler called him, actually failed to categorise Robert's work from this period entirely, when he said, well, you were trying to be a New York painter and you read Greenberg incorrectly. To which Robert replied, I don't think anyone's ever read him correctly. Or is he a poet of procedure and self-determined operations? This is a work called Drawings from the Page, where Robert took, I think, he linked the same words together, and this we consider as a drawing. Peter Cripps, you might correct me later.
Pairing of C's.
Thank you. In which case we might consider him a member of the initially French, now international Oulipo movement, yet to be recognised. Clearly, he can no longer be called the best-kept secret of the Australian art world. But where he might fit, which is the bugbear of art historical categories, is he a Queensland artist, isn't clear. And as I came in, I saw this wonderful work by Richard Bells, and I thought, well, if there is no Australian art, where is Bob? We might discuss this later in the day. But until then, I leave you with the small boy who both is and isn't Robert MacPherson, the painter, Robert Pini, or as his French-born great-grandfather might have called him, Robert Pen, wide-eyed, watchful, collecting and keeping cicadas, names and more, working his way through the world, exercising what he calls the primal will to mark, tool, in this case pencil, in hand. Thank you.